please convene the Committee on Finance?
Thank you, Chair Campbell. Will the meeting of the Committee on Finance please come to order? It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Does any committee member wish to remove any item from the consent agenda? Hearing none, is there any objection to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. We have two discussion items. Item 4 is an information item on the appointment of the California State University Investment Advisory Committee Chair. The item will be presented by Steve Relier.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. This item provides the board with information regarding the appointment of Trustee Jack McGrory as the new CSU Investment Advisory Committee Chair. I want to thank Trustee McGrory for taking on this important role. Details on his appointment to this committee may be found in the agenda item. But I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the valuable service and leadership of Trustee Peter Taylor as the inaugural chair of the CSU Investment Advisory Committee. During his tenure as chair of this committee, Trustee Taylor led the selection of an investment advisor to assist the CSU, and he was instrumental in the establishment of governance and guiding investment principles for the total return portfolio. Furthermore, he oversaw the launch and subsequent growth of the portfolio, and he presided over the first annual dividend this last year in 2019, which generated $22 million to assist campuses in funding critical capital projects. Trustee Taylor was a champion of the legislation that broadened the CSU's investment authority, and under his leadership, the total return portfolio has performed as we had hoped, as a means to provide additional facility resources to support our students. Trustee Taylor, the California State University expresses its sincerest appreciation and gratitude for your leadership. Chair McGrory, that concludes.
I want to thank Steve Relier for that. I hope it was recorded so I can play it back for my kids. And a special thanks to the great investment team, Scott, Ron, Robert at CSU, who did just tremendous work. The last 3 years was a lot of work, but a lot of accomplishments, and I really appreciate the acknowledgement, Stephen. Thank you.
And I appreciate being volunteered for this, and I'm only accepting this position because you agreed to assist me. Thank you, Peter, for all your service.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Steve. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item, which is a very easy item. Item 5 is also an information item on the 2020-2021 final budget. The item will be presented by Steve Relier and Ryan Storm, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget. Steve?
Thank you, Chair McGrory. So this agenda item is intended to provide a brief recap of the state's final budget decisions related to the CSU and the trustees' budget request for the 2020-21 fiscal year. Now, before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone involved for their advocacy this year. You know, it started as a promising year, but with the arrival of COVID-19 and its severe impact on the economy and the state budget, it left state leaders with very difficult choices. I also want to thank the governor, the pro tem, the speaker, and other legislators for keeping the CSU a priority in the final budget agreement. State leaders understand the value of the California State University to California and Californians, and they did their best under very difficult budget circumstances. Many state programs, including the CSU, were significantly reduced. Based on a comparison between the initial budget reduction proposals and the final result, it is clear that the advocacy efforts by so many helped avoid deeper budget cuts. While this is very challenging, the CSU will weather this downturn because of several key strategies that we have and will employ this year. So Assistant Vice Chancellor Ryan Storm will now go into more detail on the final state budget items that affect the university. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now. Ryan?
Thank you, Steve. So last month, the state wrapped up its work on the budget for 2021, and it is important to share with you the final funding decisions made by the state on behalf of the CSU. But before I do, it is important to provide the background and context. Since we began developing the system-wide budget plan 10 months ago, much has changed. We entered fall 2019, having just received one of the largest state investments in decades. The prospects for additional state investment for 2021 were good. Then the state's fortunes turned for the worse, and the dramatic economic impact of COVID-19. Over a handful of months, the state's forecast turned from a modest surplus of $5.6 billion to an anticipated $54.3 billion deficit. Now, the final state budget agreement was approved in late June. State leaders will employ various deficit narrowing strategies to balance the 2021 state budget. Examples are the use of the state's rainy day fund, reductions to existing programs and agency funding, reductions to civil servant compensation, those are non-CSU employees, borrowing from state special funds, and deferral of expenses across fiscal years. Now, this slide lists the known fiscal impacts the CSU will experience in 2021. Recurring state support for the CSU will be reduced by $299 million in 2021 as compared to 1920 levels. That is a 7.5% reduction in state general fund support, and that's equivalent to 4.2% reduction to the CSU operating budget. That's the combination of general fund, tuition, and fee revenue. So after the reduction, the operating budget now stands at $6.9 billion per year. Changes in student enrollment patterns and behaviors, that includes changes in student average unit load due to the success of Graduation Initiative 2025. Those will result in an estimated drop in tuition revenue of $24.2 million. Also, due to the state general fund reduction and the anticipated reduction in tuition revenue for 2021, campuses will not receive new funding to help cover $46.5 million in anticipated mandatory cost increases, such as healthcare premium increases, as well as pension rate increases. So in total, funding reductions and unfunded items will total at least $369.7 million. So these impacts come on the heels of other challenges we shared at the last board meeting. Due to COVID-19 and the shift to a virtual modality, campuses are also dealing with significant revenue losses in their self-supported enterprise programs, as well as their nonprofit auxiliary organizations. We shared then an estimated $337 million cost and revenue loss estimate for spring 2020 alone. And we anticipate similar challenges in these areas for fall 2020. We will provide you an estimate for the fall when it is available. But it's clear that campuses will continue to deal with reduced student housing occupancy, loss of foot traffic, limited dining options, and limited demand for parking, all of which will persistently keep revenue down because of COVID-19. I have a little more to share on the general fund recurring reduction of the $299 million. The state budget includes billions of dollars in reductions and deferrals that will be restored if at least $14 billion in federal funds are received by October 15 of 2020. If the state receives between $2 billion and $14 billion from the federal government, the CSU would be provided a proportional share of this one-time funding in 2021 to mitigate the reduction and potentially augment the CSU operating budget on a one-time basis. That sliding scale would range between $71 million up to $494 million in one-time funding to the CSU, depending on how much, if any, federal funds are provided to the state. The CSU and many CSU stakeholders are advocating for that additional funding from the federal government. As an example, Chancellor White advocated for additional funding during his congressional testimony a few weeks ago. We hope that those advocacy efforts, as well as efforts by others in the state, will lead to better funding outcome later this fall. But in the meantime, we have a final state budget decision that has reduced our recurring funding, and we have put in motion plans to address that reduction. So while the state reduction is disappointing, yet understandable, it will likely postpone key initiatives, either planned or underway. We begin 2021 with one-time and recurring strategies that will help mitigate this reduction. Consequently, the budgets of all 23 campuses and the Chancellor's Office were reduced earlier this month on a recurring basis. In consultation with campus presidents, the Chancellor's Office has reduced budgets by 2 methodologies of equal value. 50% of the reduction is based on each campus's prorated share of the total operating budget. So in other words, an across-the-board methodology. The other half of the reduction is based on student demographics. More specifically, campuses with greater numbers of low-income students, underserved students, and other disadvantaged students will retain more of their funding than campuses who have fewer of these students. To address this budget reduction, campuses and the Chancellor's Office will employ short-term, one-time budget balancing strategies, as well as longer-term recurring strategies. For example, the CSU has prudently grown reserves to meet certain strategic goals, one of which has been preparation for possible economic uncertainty. The CSU has already drawn upon these reserves on a one-time basis to maintain operations and programs impacted by the coronavirus. And we appreciate the acknowledgement by the state legislature of our already underway efforts. Other one-time opportunities are the use of remaining federal CARES Act funds, limits to travel and new employee hiring, and implementing efficiencies or cost avoidances. A longer-term recurring strategy is recurring funding reductions to campus and Chancellor's Office operations. Now, the final budget agreement also includes a handful of positive developments for the CSU. The state provided $6 million of one-time money for 2021 summer term financial aid for students. The budget agreement also contains $3 million one-time for emergency student financial aid for eligible AB 540 students. And with that, Steve has some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Ryan. I want to thank the board for your important role in this year's budget process. Your and other CSU stakeholder advocacy efforts were critical in keeping the CSU a high priority for legislators and the governor, thereby minimizing further reductions to the CSU budget. Campus and Chancellor's Office leaders are using all of the CSU strategies shared in this presentation to address the immediate budget shortfall, as well as putting in motion longer-term programmatic changes that will ensure a high-quality education for all CSU students while maintaining balanced budgets. COVID-19 has been a significant burden on Californians, including our students and their families, and has had a very negative impact on their employment, their income, and household costs. Therefore, the option of increasing tuition is not an appropriate strategy today. Over the past 8 years, tuition increased only once in 2017-18, which was $270 per year, and that was in order to start the graduation initiative. Tuition increases have been a rare part of our funding strategy in the past, and if the state's economy becomes more dire later this year, it may be necessary to revisit this and other options. But as of today, and assuming current conditions and assumptions persist, we have no plans to recommend increasing tuition during the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And as Ryan noted earlier, CSU advocacy for additional federal funding will continue through the fall with the hope that we could temporarily mitigate the budget reduction with federal assistance. Chair McGrory, that concludes our report, and we're happy to address questions.
Steve, I just want to make sure I understand the overall strategy. Half of the budget reduction was prorated out to the campuses to make cuts or use reserves that they had?
Yeah, so as Ryan outlined, in addition to the various strategies such as, hiring freezes, eliminating most of travel, other programmatic reductions. In order to manage their portion of the cut, we allocated that cut to all the campuses. Half of that allocation of that reduction was based on a prorated basis on their, based on how much that campus's budget is to the total CSU budget. And the other half is adjusted based on the demographics, the student demographics of the campus. So campuses, as you know, our campuses have a very different set of student demographics in terms of, and particularly in terms of students' ability to pay tuition. And so we took that into account for half of that reduction strategy, is that those campuses who had the students who had the least ability to pay tuition took a smaller reduction than those campuses who had fewer of those students.
And then the campuses can either do operating cuts on their own or go into their own reserves on the campus?
That's right. Yeah, we work with the campuses on utilization of their reserves. Each campus gets directly from the federal government a specific CARES institutional component, as well as the CARES money that was provided to individual students. So that campus can draw that money down. Now, the strategy that we've encouraged campuses to take is to first go to other strategies such as reserves, the travel and programmatic cuts, and then bring down the CARES money. That CARES money, Ryan, I think it was about $260 million roughly on the institutional side.
Pretty close. I would say that there's two different tranches of federal funds that we received that could be used to mitigate COVID, and it was about $301 million combined for all the campuses.
Right. That's right. We had a second tranche of money that came later for in a different category of CARES money. So when you combine that with the other 260, it is a little bit north of $300 million. So that money sits there, and campus by campus, they can draw that money down. That money can essentially be used for any costs that are related to COVID-19 or any losses in revenue that are related to COVID-19. And that money can also reimburse the use of reserves when we're mitigating those kind of costs. So, examples would be as a campus has to gear up to invest in additional technology infrastructure to deliver classes virtually, to do additional faculty training, to deliver classes virtually, to get technology into the hands of students, to expand Wi-Fi availability. Those kind of investments can be used where we can use this CARES money to reimburse for those things. On the flip side, where we've lost revenue, say in housing or parking or other student enterprises or self-funded enterprises, we can also use CARES money either directly to reimburse for that or reimburse the use of reserves that are used in those cases.
But the CARES money also had to take care of the hole that the COVID caused in the existing or the last fiscal year as well.
That's right. But, we actually have done more in utilization of reserves in this last fiscal year, in the last quarter of the fiscal year, than bringing down CARES money. And that's deliberate. We really want to sequence this stuff because CARES money can not only be used for those costs directly, but can also be used to reimburse reserves that are used for those costs.
Okay, we have three trustees that would like to speak at this point. The first is Romy.
Good morning. I have a question, and you can take it as a suggestion. Given the multi-year impact of the pandemic on our budget, would it not make sense to offer incentives to retire or to retire early for tenure-line faculty members? It would have several impacts. It would have an immediate financial impact. And of course, obviously, we hope that these tenure-line positions would be replaced. However, we could defer that replacement for a few years. So during the next coming 2 or 3 years, we would save a significant amount of money, I think, if the offer was accepted. And another good effect would be many of our lecturers are currently afraid about their continued employment. We are not certain about the enrollment and the amount of classes we can offer. If we had an additional amount of tenure-line faculty retire, it would preserve the employment for several of our lecturers. And lastly, from a health perspective, you can imagine that those who would be incentivized to retire or retire earlier than they had planned are in that age group that would be most vulnerable to COVID. They might be, some of them might be apprehensive about returning to in-person instructions. So I think such an incentive to retire at this point, and your finance division could work out how that incentive could be. It wouldn't not necessarily have to be in let's say in concrete dollars, but in service years or something similar that would not affect our budget immediately. Such an incentive could be a win-win situation in many respects. So if you have considered it, please enlighten me about plans or why this is not a good idea. And if you haven't considered it, I would like you to ponder that opportunity.
Trustee Sebelius, it's really a good point that you brought up, and so thank you for bringing it up because we are considering it, and our campuses are looking at it as well as the system. I'm going to make a few remarks about that, and then I'm going to ask Evelyn Nazario, who is much more familiar with these kinds of programs from the HR perspective, to make some comments. First thing is that when you compare CSU, and first of all, I think this is a really good strategy, and it's been used successfully by universities in the past during budget downturns. It's also been problematic for universities in the past who have used it. It doesn't always achieve the goals, the financial goals that you hope it's going to achieve, but it can, and it really depends on how it's structured. One difference between CSU and some of our peer institutions, which does provide some constraints to us, is that universities who actually operate their own retirement systems and have the ability to make adjustments to, as you suggested, service credit for years of service and other, and using the assets of that retirement system to create incentives. That is different from us. And I'll just pick you on UC because UC is our fellow big public higher education system in California. UC has its own retirement system, and UC has in the past structured these incentive programs during a downturn. Circumstances were very, very different when they did that. They probably will not do this again I'm guessing for the foreseeable future. Now, I haven't talked to anybody at UC, but when they did this, their retirement system was actually overfunded by a huge amount. And actually, this solved that problem as well. Conversely, CSU does not have its own retirement system. Whatever we would do would have to be in concert with the state of California in the CalPERS system. So that provides a constraint right there. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to do, or it's not off the table, or there may be other mechanisms that we can use to encourage retirement. But I think your overall point is on target, that it is, when we look at our cost structure, we are, 75 to 80% in personnel costs. And any organization has to look at that. And incentives like that should be viewed and analyzed very carefully. But we have to ensure that the objectives, the financial objectives are achieved. So many universities go down this road, and I've seen this, and they will involve these things. And then once the individuals take those retirements, they will, in many cases, they find that, well, this was a critical position. This was a critical faculty member that had to teach this class. So we're going to have to backfill. We're going to have to, hire someone else to do that. So it doesn't always, the Internal Revenue Service has their own rules that say that you cannot pick and choose who you offer these programs to. So the people who are perhaps the most productive and maybe the most mobile may also be the ones who will be the first to take advantage of these programs. So there's a lot of issues, but again, I keep going back to the bottom line that your point is very valid, that it is something we need to carefully look at and weigh the pros and cons, even with the challenges of not really having our own retirement system and that kind of thing. With that, I'm going to ask Evelyn Nazario to add any other color commentary she wants to provide.
Thank you, Steve. So Steve hit the nail on the head. He's absolutely right. Our situation is very different than you see because our retirement is under CalPERS. So I'm going to go back in time a little when there was a golden handshake given to staff and at one point faculty back in early on, can't remember exactly the years. And what we found out after that was all done and said, that we did not actually have the cost savings that we thought we were going to have with offering the golden handshake. And the golden handshake resulted in individuals up to getting more service credit, exactly what Trustee Sabalis was talking about. Also, with being a part of CalPERS, in order for the CSU to attempt to do this, and it's not that it's not doable, but it is quite a lengthy process because we would need to actually do an analysis of what that would look like, cost savings we would be obtaining from this possible golden handshake, if we would call it that. And we would have to then present that to our governor, and our governor would have to put together an executive order actually giving us the permission to offer this, of course, in partnership with CalPERS, because CalPERS would also be involved in this. I think back then we were in a very different time than we are now. I mean, when you think about the market and how it's fluctuated, and when you look at how CalPERS is actually right now, had a dip in their funds also. I don't anticipate that would be something that would be somewhat that they would maybe want to consider at this time. But I do agree with Steve too, that we have to maybe think outside of the box and sort of think of what other things that we can actually do to entice individuals that are ready for retirement, right? And at a good place in their life to do so, to maybe offer something that would entice them, that would say, yes, this would be a good time for them. So not that it's not doable. Again, it is just a lengthy process. And based on the times that we're in, don't know how open we'll be to that. But again, time to think outside the box and see what else we can do.
Thank you very much for your responses. In my vision, it should be a win-win situation, a win for the system, a win for the retiring faculty, and a win for the lecturers that might be retained. But thank you for your consideration and your detailed answer.
Trustee Sabalis, this is Tim White. There's one other factor that's a natural incentive without anything separate. And that is for people who have many years of service in the CSU and who are of retirement age and have been thinking about retiring. Now that we're in an extended contract with no salary across the board, general salary increases for the next couple of years, those individuals might consider retiring before December. And entering into CalPERS. And if that were the case, then they would be in CalPERS. And again, it depends on age and years of service, but they may very well be at the same salary or close to the same salary. But CalPERS then, if they were to retire in the calendar year 2020, they would be eligible for the cost of living increase in CalPERS in January of 2022. And in January of 2023, and those have been historically 2%, 3%, 4%, depending on how the market's been. So for those who are staying employed at a flat salary or considering retirement, there are going to be incremental bumps going forward. And that may be a natural incentive for some to say, at the end of this academic fall, that it's time to step aside, or on the staff side as well.
Thank you for pointing that out, but that is an option and an opportunity that exists every year. But you are right. I mean, with the anticipation of none or low salary increases, this might be an attractive proposition to time your retirement to catch the COLA. But that can happen every year, right?
Mhm.
Thank you. Trustee Morales.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, thank you for your report. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. It's been alluded in the material somewhat, but I want to make sure they're recorded here for our open session. One of them is, how is our investments doing during this age of the pandemic? And then the other is, how will our reserves be impacted? I know the Chancellor has been communicating with us as trustees of how he is managing that, but if you could remind us of that would be helpful.
Thank you, Trustee Morales. What I'll do is I'll start with the second one, the reserves, and talk about that a little, and then I'm going to turn it over to Robert Eaton, who is here today, who can comment on our investments. First thing on the reserves, we're working very closely with the campuses on how they can best utilize those reserves to mitigate the impacts on their campus programs. And I can tell you that the presidents and their cabinets are paying a lot of attention to this and have already started using their reserves starting with the last quarter of this year. And so those reserves have been spent down a bit, I'd say, over the last 4 months. We've probably spent down roughly $67 million of reserves. That's out of perhaps about 460 or so, $467 million. So we're probably down to about 400 million in terms of our economic uncertain reserve that's designed for these types of actions. And we'll continue to manage that over the next year. The reserve strategy is really that we're employing really is based not on this fiscal year problem, but us believing this could be a 3-year problem. And so it would not be prudent for us to spend down those reserves dramatically in the first year and not, I guess you could say, keep our powder dry for the next couple of years, because, we just don't know. There's so many assumptions that can affect what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to California. I mean, even a variable like wildfires will affect California's economy and its ability to fund other types of entities in the state. So the result of the federal elections, what happens with the biology of this virus, when is the vaccine going to be available, all will impact what we might have to do with those reserves over the next 3 years. So that's kind of how we're managing that. I'm going to now turn it over to Robert Eaton to comment on the performance of our investments during this time.
Thank you, Steve. Trustee Morales, in response to your question, our investments are actually doing fine right now. We have about 4.7 billion total investments. About 3.6 billion of that is in our liquidity portfolio, or we also call our SWIFT portfolio. And that's high quality fixed income securities. It's really driven, the value of that is really driven by the level of interest rates. Interest rates have come down considerably, so the yield on that has dropped. Ironically, the return is up because as the yield goes down, the value of the investments increase. But it's holding and doing quite well. The remaining 1.1 billion is in our total return portfolio. And as you know, that's the investment portfolio that has also investments in equity investments, as well as some real estate investments and other commodities. That one has seen much more volatility, but it is doing quite well now. In February, we were up. That portfolio right now has about 1.1 billion in it. We were up about 107 million in value in February. when the deepest part of the market was hit due to COVID-19 in March, we actually dropped and we were at negative 177 million. But now the market has returned and we are to the good. We're in the money about 53 million. We have an unrealized gain position on that portfolio. So we're doing fine. It has performed as we would hope it would. And so it's been able to withstand the volatility in the market. So
That's good news. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Trustee Steinhauser.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And to Steve, Robert, and Ryan, thank you for your work and the report. I have a couple of questions. One, I know the CARES Act has multiple various deadlines that the money has to be spent by. Some December, some by 2022. So if you could tell me in the CSU what our deadline is to spend this money, and knowing that this is an ongoing reduction of $299 million, and knowing that if we do get new money in a next stimulus, that would be a one-time deposit, so to speak. What is, off the top of your head, our operating deficit going to be?
So I'm going to ask Ryan to jog my memory on the CARES deadline for the institutional component that we're using to mitigate some of these reductions. Ryan, is it at the end of the fiscal year?
You know, Steve, I wish I could jog your mind, but I can't. I can't recall either when we are to utilize those funds. One thing that I will point out, though, is that with whatever the deadline is, if it's even within 6 months, I think we could comfortably say that we'll be utilizing that funding for two reasons. One is that when we surveyed the spring 2020 term losses and costs, we were looking at well over $300 million in impact there. Preliminarily, we don't have all the data yet, but we have some information in from campuses for the fall term. And what we have there is that we're looking at, close to $200 to $300 million of additional costs associated with COVID, revenue losses again, as well as potential costs. So now those are estimates in both of those instances, but you're looking at pretty significant amounts of money that exceed the amount of federal funds, CARES money that has been provided. Now, I did look in the chat room just now and somebody pointed out that it looks like it's December of 2020. So thank you. And I'm going to use that as taking that to the bank. But in any case, I think we're well ahead of the game in terms of having costs and losses that we can recoup through the CARES Act funding.
Thank you.
I think the issue is actually compounded because not only do we have an operating budget cut in the governor's budget, but we have a loss of revenue in these auxiliaries, both between campus bookstores, housing, and parking that we have to deal with as well.
Yep.
It's a really good point, Trustee McGrory. This is probably what distinguishes this business downturn from every other one that either CSU or UC has experienced over the last number of decades. Typically, as the state's budget gets hammered through a business cycle downturn, the safe zone has been those self-funded enterprises who are not dependent on state revenues. Those, in fact, got hammered much harder this time around prior to the state's budget being affected. So very different situation. I also want to just highlight Trustee Steinhauser's comment about the one-time nature of the CARES money. And this, you can also extend that to our reserves as well, that what the CARES money helps us do, and the reserves help us do, is not solve structural budget problems, but what they help us do is buy us time to solve those structural budget problems. So this is what's confronting our 23 presidents and their cabinets is, they've got time now to use some of these mechanisms to weather a portion of the storm, but they are going to have to make those recurring reductions in programs, in hiring and travel, in other types of things as well. And again, we have to think of this as a multi-year issue, not a 2021 issue.
Trustee Carney.
Thank you. I have two questions and a comment. these are my questions. How does enrollment look for the fall and the budgetary impacts of that? My second question has to do with the state university grant program. Will that continue in its usual form? And is that question determined at the campus level or the chancellor's office level? And then my comment is that I'm very grateful to our faculty and staff for once again proving their dedication to our students and to the mission of the CSU in helping the organization get through this crisis. Thank you.
Trustee Carney, thank you for those questions. I'm going to make a comment, and then I'm going to right now warn Lauren Blanchard to comment on the enrollment, because he knows a lot more about this and follows this closer than I do. One thing I will mention is that in Ryan's description of some of the details of the budget problem, of the budget issue earlier, one thing he did do on one of his slides is mention that in addition to the state reduction in our recurring budget, and in addition to the self-funded enterprises losing revenue, that he did put in a factor for changes in our enrollment, not just in terms of numbers of students on campuses, but also kind of what we'll call student behavior. And some of that behavior is actually, it's really good behavior. They're actually, it's more and more of our students are taking more classes and taking more units and getting to their degrees faster. But it also means, based on how we structure tuition, that we're not recouping additional tuition dollars for those successful students. So that has an impact as well. So there is a dollar impact of that. I know that institutions around the country are looking very carefully at fall enrollments. Early indications are that CSU's enrollments still look strong for the fall, but there's going to be a lot of lumpiness from campus to campus. And I know Lauren and his team are watching that pretty carefully. So Lauren, do you want to make a comment about that?
Sure, and good morning. Steve, you really painted the picture pretty clearly. The fact that what we are hearing from campus is just based on some of the work that they are doing in estimating how many students we will have, both in terms of returning students as well as first-time students, that at this point, based on the intent to register, that those numbers are looking relatively good. Now, I want to temper that, because obviously we know that we really won't know
May have lost Lauren there.
I think we may have lost Lauren's audio. Lauren, if you can hear us, you might want to try turning off your video to see if that helps the audio problem.
Face-to-face instruction, which also means that there will be
Okay, Steve, I think we may have lost him.
Okay, well, I think, fortunately that I think Lauren did give you most of the information. So again, overall for CSU, I think enrollment looks strong and it looks like it's going to hold. What we've heard from third parties is that perhaps one of the differences between how CSU's enrollment is going to fare in the fall compared to some of our peer institutions is that the value that is perceived in terms of the quality of education for the size of the tuition at CSU is very different than for most American universities, particularly the private universities. And they are probably more vulnerable at this time in terms of enrollment as students make decisions about what they're going to do in the fall.
So Steve, I think the other thing about enrollment, since we lost Lauren, is the variability piece. And some of our campuses, depending on their, like in the Central, Stan State and Fresno have very strong interest over their last year. and some other campuses have, particularly in the north, have less interest. And the LA Basin area is got many more potential students than Northern California, independent of COVID these days. So there will be variability. And the other question, Jane, you had was dealing with SUG, our state university grant that supports our students, and we're not making any changes in the SUG policy. We want to continue to have the support. Plus there's Cal Grants, and the governor's budget did increase the Cal Grant amount, recognizing that there could be more students and more families in financial need this upcoming year because of loss of jobs or underemployment. And so, you know, again, the real message to our students is if your income level has changed because of COVID, go to financial aid, make sure they recalculate your financial aid package. And if you're eligible for more state, federal, or SUG money, then you will be able to do that. But don't let lower family income get in the way of thinking about continuing your studies at California State University. And as we've always had, if you're in a family of $70,000 or less and eligible for financial aid, that tuition and fees will be fully covered. Recognizing there are other costs associated with attendance that's been discussed, but at least tuition and fees can be covered.
Just to add a little bit more on State University grant, Trustee Carney, our fee policy requires that whatever, if we ever do raise tuition, that we would contribute a 1/3 of that tuition revenue towards the SUG program. So last time it was raised was in 17-18, like we mentioned in the presentation, because in order to get a graduation initiative off the ground. So that brought the total for SUG to $701 million system-wide. And we have been at that $701 million every year since then, including this down year. So SUG is completely held harmless in this instance.
Thank you.
Trustee James?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So I just want to go back to the part where I think, Steve, you mentioned the CARES Act, and kind of, I'm curious to see where the rest of that money's going, since the deadline is somewhere in December of this year, or where that allocation is happening and what that money is helping.
So there's, thank you, Trustee James. Good question. The CARES money has been a very important one-time help, not just to the universities in helping them deal with the revenue losses and the additional costs associated with COVID-19, but half of the money that came from the CARES Act went directly to students to help with unusual expenses that they had, they and their families had, according to this. And Ryan, I forgot the size of the dollar components of the two halves that went to students. And can you remind me that?
I believe it was, off the top of my head, I believe it was in the area of $263 million was for emergency grants to students. And there was an equivalent piece to help campuses deal with costs and revenue losses. And then an additional amount of money that we mentioned earlier that came a little bit later, that was to help campuses with, again, cost and revenue losses. I think in terms of the how you'll find out about that, Trustee, is that all of our campuses are required to directly report to the federal government those sorts of outlays, so to speak, and uses of those funds. So that will be coming later. But as of right now, we don't have a really good sense. We don't have a report that we could share with you today and say it's for these particular items. So.
Thank you.
And again, that the CARES Act money has been, the expenditures against that have followed expenditures against other strategies that we mentioned earlier, such as reserves and these other things. So it is going to lag a little bit. The actual allocation of the CARES money did not come to the CSU system. It actually came to each of our individual campuses. So that's a relationship directly between the Department of Education and that individual campus.
Trustee Keynes, this is Tim White. I think it's important to recognize that one of the elements in the CARES dollars that came to the institution was flexibility in how it would be used to meet the institution's needs. And the president and I and all of us were grateful for that flexibility, because when you manage and provide leadership to a university at times like this, you have to have your values in place, and we do have the values: health, safety, and student success and progress. But the way in which you depends on the circumstances of your campus, how you end up using those dollars to advance those core mission. So do expect at the end of the day that Campus X will be spending CARES money on something, and Campus Y will be spending CARES money on something totally different. But both are around executing the mission and managing the unique circumstance of that campus. And what we don't want to do is get into a position later this year or next year as everything is reconciled and say, well, gosh, Campus X used it for something and they didn't do what Campus Y did. And that's often the case in a system where people think everybody should do it the same way. But I think the flexibility, in addition to the money, the flexibility of its use is one of the great strengths of those CARES dollars going forward. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Yeah. Trustee Morales.
Yeah, I want to keep on with the subject of the CARES Act. As each of the campuses thank you for clarifying about how the CARES money was applied for and received. So each one of the applicants, in this case, each one of the campuses did have to put forward in their application what is the proposed use of the money in line with the initial guidelines. So I don't know whether those are public or not. But anyway, everybody had to do that before they would be processed. But I had a question about the auxiliaries, because I think we've been thinking, at least I've been thinking as a trustee, about how much money our institutions got, in this case, each of the campuses. But you did refer to the auxiliaries. So I assume that the auxiliaries, many of them are 501c3s by themselves. Am I correct? Or, because they are tied to each of the campuses. So were they eligible to apply for CARES money? And then did they in this case?
I'll provide some information, and I'll turn it over to Ryan to fill in the blanks. Trustee Morales, it's a good question, and one of the things that is not intuitive is that we really do have, when I think of enterprises that do not receive, student support enterprises and other support enterprises that do not receive any operating dollars like general funds and tuition, there's kind of two categories. One is what you just mentioned, which are auxiliaries that are separate 501c3 organizations that are there to serve the campus and their students. But we also have a large number of self-funded enterprises that kind of look like auxiliaries, but they're actually embedded in the campus itself. And so an example of that on most campuses is housing, which is the biggest of all of those kinds of enterprises in terms of self-funded enterprises. Typically, that is going to be actually inside the campus and not part of a 501c3. And that also has been probably the hardest hit in terms of revenue loss for these self-funded enterprises. So it is clearly stated in the regulations for the CARES Act that helping shore up lost revenue of those self-funded enterprises like housing is allowable as an expense. I will ask Ryan to fill in any blanks in terms of the 501c3s and their eligibility for CARES Act money.
Right. So the auxiliaries were eligible for a program called PPP that had its own kind of track, so to speak. Those were separate entities that had separate funding stream. I think one of the things that you'll probably recall is that there was a lot of challenges with that program. There was an incredible number of businesses and auxiliaries and nonprofit organizations that wanted to participate in that program. And there was just not enough money to go around early in the coronavirus. Some of our campuses were able to gain some of our auxiliaries were able to gain some of that funding, and some are using it. And in other instances, another instance with the program at the federal level was that some guidance came out after the application process, so that further refined the rules. And in some instances, it didn't work for businesses, and it also didn't work for other nonprofit organizations based on the terms and conditions of that program. But at the minimum, not all of our auxiliaries, those who were eligible, could apply for that PPP program. And then those who still felt that the program guidance was still germane to their situation, they still have access to those funds if they were awarded grants from the federal government.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Trustee Campbell.
Yeah, just to clarify, Ryan, on the PPP, those were loans, correct, that in some cases were forgivable?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Trustee Campbell, any other questions for the staff? Well, I just want to express our appreciation to the Chancellor's Office and the President's for dealing with what has become one of the most challenging periods of time in recent history here, and hope that, and I know Chancellor White is preserving the values and these as we go through the cuts, and hopefully we will maintain the priority of funding the graduation initiative during this difficult period of time. Any other questions? Trustee Campbell, that concludes the business of the Committee on Finance.
Thank you, Trustee McGrory, and thank you all for that thorough and sobering report. Trustee Farrar, will you please convene the Committee on Governmental Relations?
Yes.